Johnny Miller, journalist, thank you for accepting our invitation and being present in our interview. Well, you as a journalist who had a personal experience being present in Donbas region, Ukrainian parts, what is your personal experience from that situation that we have experienced in Ukraine?
Well, my personal experience, when you're covering a war, it depends which side you're on, which side of the battle lines. So in the west of Ukraine, most people support Ukraine and are very much against Russia. Russia is striking targets in Ukraine, but most of the time I was in Donetsk, which is the Russian side. So the south and the east of the country, there's a huge amount of pro-Russians. Ukraine is a very multi-ethnic country. So in Donetsk, the vast majority of their people there are pro-Russian, and it's Ukraine striking targets in Donbas, often civilian targets. So personal experience, two of my apartments were hit by missiles. Whenever there's bombing, you go out, sometimes it's a bus station or a school or a market with bodies lying in the streets. So it's very difficult there. Civilians are dying on both sides. And the reason I went is I believe there is a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. And few people in the world are really pushing for that, particularly NATO and indeed Russia. There is a peaceful solution. I think it's important to promote that.
So, well, you have encountered with many Ukrainians, you call them pro-Russians. What are their reaction after the war? Have the reaction of the population in that region changed after the war? Because the Ukrainian government is trying to show that there is a super-nationalism in those regions against Russia. So what was your reaction? What can you tell us about that?
It's a complex war. Ukraine used to be a neutral country between Russia and the West, a kind of buffer state, if you like. Then in 2014, there was a revolution or a coup, whatever you want to call it, in which Ukrainian nationalists came to power with the help of the West. And the first thing they did, one of the first things they did was stop Russian being the official language. And in Crimea, in the south of the country, in the east of the country, they're predominantly pro-Russian areas, Russian-speaking areas. So Russia then annexed Crimea, which is vital to its geostrategic security, and the east of the country rose up because they didn't agree with the Ukrainian nationalists taking power. So you've had this civil war for the last going on 9 years there between pro-Russians in the east and the Ukrainian nationalist government. And then, of course, Russia invaded early last year. And that's when it's shot to global attention. So the war goes back much further. It has three elements, really. It's a civil war between Ukrainian nationalists and its pro-Russian population. It's also an attempt by Russia to secure, as it sees it, its geostrategic security, Crimea, and to stop NATO threatening its borders. And it's also an attempt by NATO to damage Russian power. Of course, Russia was involved in Syria, Russia's reasserting itself globally, and NATO's trying to damage Russian power. It's also a proxy war in this developing conflict between the West and the East, NATO and China and Russia and Iran. So it's a complex war with many facets.
So what is your analysis regarding the media coverage on Ukrainian war? Because we have seen lots of change from the very beginning of war and what we are experiencing right now. You as a journalist and as what we have experienced there, what is the real policy of the Ukrainian government to cover the situation inside Ukraine?
Well, there aren't really many honest journalists in the world. People think journalists are honest people. Most of them are paid by people and trying to push an agenda. And in this war, depends which side you're on. NATO media has gone full propaganda mode. It's extreme, the propaganda in NATO countries. Any serious international political thinker knows perfectly well that NATO played a large role in provoking this war, and knows as well there is a peaceful solution. But NATO is pushing the idea the only way to end this war is through arms. So there's huge propaganda on that side. On the Russian side as well, there's huge propaganda. They call it a special military operation. There's reasons for that. It is an invasion, of course. But there's propaganda on the Russian side as well. So I think to find the truth about what's happening is many independent journalists, and looking at both sides. There's some very good journalists in NATO countries, fantastic journalists in Russia, and fantastic journalists in Iranians as well. and looking at different sources and trying to understand what's happening there and what's the best way forward.
Yeah. Well, as last part of our discussion, well, as you know, since I think 2 or 3 months ago, the Ukrainian government has started a propaganda about Iran's presence and rule in Ukrainian war. I mean, selling drones to be used against Ukrainian. It seems to the Iranian people that it's a kind of trick to grab Iranians' legs and bring it to the war inside the crisis. So what is the reaction of the people there? And you have seen, is this really matter inside the Ukrainian crisis? I mean, Iranian rule.
Well, I think whether it's true or not, I mean, I think Iran gave some drones before the conflict started. Whether they are now, I don't know. It's quite murky. Of course, Iran has a military cooperation with Russia, so Iran is seen to be on Russia's side. And so Ukrainians, I think, are increasingly against Iranians, I think, because they see them as allied with Russia. The Russians are much more friendly to Iranians because they see them as friends with them. So one way or another, Iran has been dragged into this, whether fairly or unfairly. But the world is dividing, sadly. You know, the United States is trying to hold on to its global hegemony. China is rising, Russia is reasserting itself, developing countries like Iran, like Brazil, like India are gaining power and strength. So we're seeing this face-off between the West and the East, and increasingly we're seeing lines drawn, and it looks like there's some kind of alliance between China, Russia and Iran. Maybe that will develop further or maybe not, but we're seeing very much a developing conflict between the East and the West.
Johnny Miller, thank you for accepting our invitation and participating in our discussion.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.